Chapter 10. Picking up a charred length of wood, Malieous located a weak spot, snapped it in half, and threw both pieces into a debris pile. "Sir!" Quinn yelled, rummaging his way through the remains of the Overseer Tower. "Here! Watch out, boy!" a guard shouted at him, hurtling a block of burnt wood toward the pile. Barking an order for the pile to be added to the nearest fire pit, Malieous looked at the boy and then scanned the market square. The square was empty, save for himself, a handful of soldiers, and a couple of townspeople who'd been generous enough to offer their assistance in the cleanup. Most of the crowd had dispersed shortly after the Overseer platform collapsed, making it easier for those who remained to put it out. Once the fire was extinguished, Malieous instructed that the useful timbers be broken up for firewood, and any reusable wood be piled underneath the gallows platform. Cleanup was going smoothly and was nearly finished. "You summoned me?" Bowing slightly, the 15-year-old couldn't conceal his agitation. Like an overwound wind-up toy, he shook all over. Seeing his master's skeptical scrutiny, he burst out, "Is it true, sir? Did Kessa escape?" Putting a firm hand on the boy's shoulder, Malieous said, "Quinn, I have 2 tasks for you. First, return to the inn, pack my things, and saddle my horse. Second, go to the castle and tell the woman there, Mirabelle, that a contingent of soldiers will be staying there. They'll need food, beds, and a place to wash up. Tell her to expect around 50. They'll be there late this afternoon. Oh, and ask her to reserve the bower for me. And thank her, please." Quinn nodded. His wide brown eyes lingered on his master, and he didn't move. "Go, boy," Malieous instructed. "I've got several more soldiers arriving soon, and they need somewhere to stay. The inn simply isn't big enough. It would be discourteous to burst in on poor Mirabelle without notice." Not usually one to gainsay his master, Quinn still didn't move. Instead, he clasped his hands together, practically pleading for an answer. Pinching the bridge of his nose, the dungeon keeper proved unable to resist the boy's puppy-dog eyes. "Yes, Quinn, it's true. Now go." Pursing his lips to keep from smiling, Quinn ran off, deftly avoiding another piece of wood chucked nearby. "Garrett!" Malieous called to the captain of his elite squad. Garrett was a brute of a man, standing approximately 7 feet tall, and weighing nearly 330 pounds. He was a sight to behold. He was neither intelligent nor stupid. He never questioned orders, and followed them to the letter. Indicative of his commanding deportment and deep baritone voice, he was useful for getting people's attention and giving orders. Not one single guard in the bunch dared ignore Garrett, despite the unknown consequences of ignoring him, since no one ever had. As soon as he'd arrived in Aquina, Malieous had summoned Garrett and his unit there, in anticipation of the king expanding his assignment. Garrett, along with Werner and a couple others, had vied for the position of captain of the Ariete after Aquestria's desertion. But Casyius disbanded the long-existing group before a winner was declared, and distributed its members as captains of different squads, keeping only 4 as his personal bodyguards. Malieous, who'd overseen the contest as one of the judges, had enjoyed watching Garrett brutalize the competition. But it was his fair-mindedness and sense of honor that really appealed to the dungeon keeper. Garrett never pressed his advantage more than was necessary, and treated his opponents with respect, even when they did not return the favor. Eons before the competition, Malieous had pegged him as a good man, and it was good to have a good man in your service.
"Yeah,"
Garrett replied. His informal response would have elicited a reprimand or at the very least an eye roll from most authority figures, but not Malieous. He didn't seem to care. "Garrett, after this mess is cleaned up, return to the inn and pack up. We'll be staying at the castle." Malieous's sentence drifted off as his focus veered toward the far end of the plaza. Garrett twisted to establish what had drawn Malieous's attention, and saw Werner and his soldiers marching toward them, their faces grimy and grim.
"Werner!"
Garrett boomed.
"Empty-handed, are you?"
Werner and Garrett, having joined the Cyrenian Guard around the same time, had known each other for years and worked alongside one another on countless occasions. But their camaraderie was unique. Malieous described it as a love-hate relationship. They never failed to pat each other on the back for their achievements, but they also never missed an opportunity to tear each other apart when they failed.
"We had them," Werner snarled.
"Had them?" Malieous's left eyebrow curved upward. Werner threw his helmet to the ground with a frustrated roar. "It should have been so easy. I split my unit. Half invaded the castle, half scouted the forest in case they got out, which they did. We pursued, cornered them against a cliff, and used the sleeping darts you gave us. Night fell. It was too dark to see, so we bound the unconscious prisoners securely to a tree and took turns guarding them." Malieous looked away as if suddenly disinterested. "Indeed."
"What happened?"
Garrett rumbled.
"Isn't it obvious?"
Werner snapped.
"They escaped."
"Someone helped them. The guards were knocked unconscious. We found the ropes severed and 3 arrows embedded in the trunk of the tree."
15 soldiers.
Garrett stressed the word soldiers with considerable scorn.
"And you, a former member of the Euriet, and 3 prisoners managed to escape from right under your noses. Did you hit yourselves with those sleeping darts, Werner?"
Garrett's brown eyes scanned Werner and his unit with obvious disapproval before peering down at Malieous for his take. The dungeon keeper's expression was, as usual, unreadable. In response to Garrett, Werner scanned the area and sneered. "Doesn't appear you did much better. I take it by the empty noose and this mess," he kicked a stray piece of wood, "that Kessa Decora still lives."
"Garrett,"
Malieous said, ignoring Werner,
"finish up here, then take charge of moving soldiers to the castle. Werner, help him. I've some things that need attending to. I'll meet you all at the castle later." "Yes, sir."
Garrett nodded, his jaw muscles relaxing. He'd been expecting an abrasive rebuke. Evidently the soldiers standing behind Werner, their postures sagging with the weight of their failure and the fear of reprisal, had expected this as well. When censuring didn't happen, they all looked at each other, astounded and relieved. Probably the only man angry they hadn't been castigated, Werner turned to them, screaming, "You heard the man! Start cleaning up!" While Garrett and Werner bellowed orders, Malieous retrieved his cloak from the steps of the gallows. Glancing up, he noted a conclave of pigeons perched atop the wall, cooing quietly to one another, amused spectators of the cleanup operation.
"They're everywhere around here, aren't they? Too bad we can't enlist their help," Garrett kidded. "We'd have this ruddy mess cleaned up in no time." "Indeed,"
Malieous granted pensively. Garrett watched as Lord Fane threw his cloak around his shoulders and adjusted the hood on his head. Stooping to pick up one of the larger, thicker pieces of lumber, A piece too large for any other man, Garrett swiveled to toss it underneath the gallows. By the time he turned back, Fane had disappeared. Shaking his head in bewilderment and wonder, Garrett continued his work. Mulling over Kessa's revelation that Casyius ordered the dungeon keeper to execute them all, Artax sipped his drink, his face indecipherable. Eventually, his head bobbed up and down as if he'd come to terms with it. Everyone else in the hovel reacted to the news with varying degrees of gravity. "I am familiar with Lord Fane," Artax said after some moments of silence. "Aquina was not my first encounter with him." What? Artax had had a previous encounter with the dungeon keeper and lived to tell the tale? Intriguing. Kessa was about to ask for more details when... "Malieous has never been assigned the task of finding Red Talon, or Madigan," Aquestria uttered. "This is bad, very bad. He's never failed to get his target." "He failed to get you and your sister, didn't he?" Artax noted pointedly. "Yes, but that's different." "Why? Because you're a woman, or because you're his wife?" "No!" Kessa piped up, taking the focus off her sister. "This man, you have no idea what he's capable of." She shuddered, remembering the overpowering impression she'd had of her brother-in-law yesterday morning in her cell. "Great Ash, Kessa, what did he do to you?" Aquestria asked with severity, recognizing the startling alteration in her sister's view and description of Malieous. Usually, when Kessa referred to Malieous, it was with intolerance or sarcasm. She'd never spoken about him with such pronounced trepidation. The many cuts and bruises covering her sister were now more apparent, and Aquestria felt a molten anger bubbling within. Understanding the motivation behind her sister's sudden wrath, Kessa shook her head, exclaiming, "No, no, no! He didn't do any of this. His methods are much more cunning and disturbing than physical assault. I don't know how to explain it. I've never seen him as a true enemy before. I mean, we've always been at odds, but this was different. Yesterday I saw a side of him." She trembled and her voice dropped off. Swallowing, she continued firmly, "Trust me, you don't want to be on his target list, and we are." For a long time no one spoke, each person feeling the impact of Kessa's warning differently. Kessa seized the brew Artax left on the table, refilled her cup, and gulped it. She shuddered again and breathed fire. At least, that's what it felt like. Laughing shakily, she replaced her cup on the table. "Strong stuff." Folding his arms absent-mindedly, Artax mused, "Yes, we need it around here." He combed both hands amidst his hair and clasped his fingers behind his head, both elbows pointing forward like protective sentinels. After a moment, he dropped his arms, stood up, and said, "If you'll excuse me, I'll go and see to dinner. Rake, you know where the guest hut is. Please show the ladies. You and Lord Aguillon can stay in here with me." After Artax left the hut, Kessa looked directly at all three of her companions. "I know Fane grabbed me, but how did he get his paws on me in the first place? I have no memory of it." Pantheus and Rake looked at the ground, and Aquestria went beet red. "We were all so tired, Kessa," she began. "All three of you slept through my capture?" Kessa blurted. There was a momentary silence. Then she muttered, "I guess it shouldn't be a surprise. After all, I did." "Rake and I had a sleeping draft. We were hoping to get a good night's rest before leaving. I thought we were safe enough." Rising from his tree stump, Pantheus sighed and turned away. "It's my fault. I had a bad feeling and I ignored it. Knowing that Equestria and Rake would sleep through just about anything, I decided to stay awake and keep an eye on things. I locked your door and sat on a chair in the hallway. As the night wore on, I became increasingly tired, and I'm ashamed to say sleep overcame me. Turning back to them, his face pale, he continued the recount. I awoke to behold a figure, clad in black. Kessa slung over his shoulder. As soon as I got up, he turned, and before I could do anything, His brow furrowed, as if he couldn't believe what he was about to say. I think he jabbed me with a dart, or his fingers, something, and I lost consciousness. But I recognized him. It was Fane. Next thing I know, I'm on the floor, and Kessa's gone. I went to awaken Rake, and Mirabelle runs up and warns us that soldiers are on their way to arrest us. I told Rake to meet us with horses by the secret exit, and tried to get into the bower, but my key was missing. I used the secret passage to get Aquestria. And you know the rest. Perhaps he used the same sleeping darts as the soldiers used on us, Rake mused aloud, fingering his chin. Strange. His motives are so muddled. We were at his mercy. He could have had all of us, and yet he just took Kessa.
Malieous plans and thinks things through very meticulously. There's a reason for everything he does, Aquestria explained. But I think his primary objective was Kessa. That's who the king sent him after. He left us to Werner. Rake shrugged.
Makes sense.
And luckily for me, he didn't plan on Artax. I guess he used that sleeping stuff on me, too. I went to sleep in a comfy, warm bed and woke up in a cell. Anyway, I'm sure glad Werner failed, and Malieous didn't get his hands on any of you. Especially you, Aquestria. Peeking at Pantheus, who was avoiding looking at her, Aquestria flushed. Do you think he knew you'd taken sleeping drafts? I mean, perhaps he's been spying on us, biding his time until the right moment to strike. Coming into the castle alone without that knowledge would be risky. Of course, Malieous could probably handle all of us without a deep breath, Kessa conjectured. Malieous has many tricks up his sleeve, believe me. I'm so sorry you endured such an ordeal, Kessa. Like I said earlier, I thought we had more time, or I would have never taken that draft. I'm sorry.
We all are, Pantheus admitted in little more than a whisper. Interesting that all the focus is on the little one, isn't it? Rake mused. I mean, you defected from a highly coveted and influential position, didn't you, Aquestria? Shouldn't Casyius be chomping at the bit for your head as well?
The door flap opened, and Artax notified them that dinner was ready. Kessa leapt from her seat. His eyes widening, Artax swiftly stepped aside to avoid being trampled as she sailed by him, heading for the dinner table. Rake slapped his brother's back.
You'll get used to it. She's very passionate about two things, Pantheus and food. And not necessarily in that order, Pantheus chuckled.
Her brow furrowed, Aquestria watched as her companions exited the hut. Rake's question unanswered and forgotten with the promise of food. Silently she contemplated it, recalling that Malieous never mentioned an execution order for her, only Kessa. She'd assumed he'd made some sort of deal in her behalf. Perhaps there was more to it. Her stomach growled. Realizing she could eat and still have plenty of time to figure things out, she left the hut. Dinner was a sight to behold. The entire colony assembled for the meal. A bonfire provided light, warmth, and a place to cook. Firelight danced playfully on people's faces as they crowded around the tables, laughing and talking with the type of free-spirited joviality that accompanied their freedom from tyranny. Several large platters of various vegetables were being passed around, and 2 succulent venison roasts rotated tantalizingly on a spit. A beefy man with a huge knife and 2-pronged fork was slicing chunks of roast venison and placing them onto people's plates as they lined up.
Kessa was third in line, holding her plate firmly but fidgeting with excitement. Sitting at the end of one of the tables, Rake was surrounded by women, who were avidly fawning all over him. Feeling a lack of appetite, Pantheus leaned against a tree, his arms folded and legs crossed, as he stood watching the spectacle. "You should eat," Aquestria advised, approaching him slowly. Nodding, he acknowledged her suggestion silently. Smoothing a hand down his back, she said soothingly, "She's safe now. Don't dwell on—" "Casyius came to see her personally. Did you see her neck? He nearly killed her, despite her pending execution. Surely you're feeling the same misgivings as me. There's more to this than a royal burglary, Addie. Kessa is in far deeper than we first supposed." Pantheus waited for a reply, and when it didn't come, he went on. "Initially, I thought the king hired Fane because of his relationship with you. But honestly, why would the king expend his best resource on a mere thief, despite the relation, unless the item she took was of vital importance or significance? Do you think he got it back?" "If he didn't, why proceed with the execution? Don't you think he'd keep her alive until he got whatever it was she took back?" Aquestria reasoned. "Why else would he come personally to Aquina?" "Then there's Artax's role in all of this,"
Pantheus submitted. "None of us sent him a message about Kessa. We had no time. We were busy being chased and detained. No time for a message to be sent, or received for that matter. Artax's orders came from another source." Pantheus rubbed his chin thoughtfully.
"Do you think Artax is Madigan?"
Aquestria scrutinized him with such an intensity that he put his hands up and declared,
"The king is wrong. I'm not Madigan. I don't have any position of authority in Red Talon."
Her beautiful brown eyes probed him inquisitively while the seconds ticked by, until she finally nodded in concession. "Although he seems very competent, I don't think Artax is Madigan either."
"How can you be so sure?"
"He just doesn't give off the right vibes," Aquestria admitted with a shrug. She didn't know how else to explain it. Then she added, "His denial was sincere, too."
"Well then, someone, probably Madigan, ordered Artax to rescue Kessa. And I think we can both agree that neither Artax nor Madigan would risk the lives of their people for a mere thief, not without a very good reason."
"Agreed. Red Talon is run with efficiency, careful planning, intelligence, and secrecy."
"So, we have two military geniuses, Casyius and Madigan, both sending their chief captains, so to speak, after Kessa. Now look me in the eye and tell me you think she's just a thief."
"I know, Pantheus. The same thoughts have been going through my mind as well. Though I wouldn't categorize Casyius as a military genius."
"Wouldn't you? He dethroned his own father and King Ash. He defeated Copperrund, keeps rebellions at bay, and is still in power, despite everyone wanting him gone. He's not a good king, but I believe he's a good strategist."
"Or he's very lucky and has the right people in his service." He swallowed, feeling somewhat awkward about asking his next question. Discretion had prevented him from broaching the subject of Equestria's disheveled state the morning of Kessa's capture, but he had to ask.
"Did Malieous mention anything the other night?"
Shaking her head, Aquestria met his eyes without flinching and quipped pragmatically, "We didn't do much talking."
Coloring slightly, Pantheus replied, "I see."
"Excellent." Artax swung round from the other side of the tree from where he'd been eavesdropping. The context of the conversation was not lost on him. "I presume you're still on Fane's good side, then? Perhaps we can use that to our advantage." "I doubt it. Malieous isn't exploitable. By me, by anyone." Aquestria smirked at him shrewdly. "Finally chose to show yourself, eh?"
Perhaps you'd care to answer some of the questions you overheard then." Artax stood very still, evidently debating whether or not he would. Half a minute had ticked by when he gestured to a young lady sitting diagonally from his brother. Unlike every other female at the table, she didn't fawn all over Rake, but sat serenely, traces of an amused smile on her tiny mouth. The instant she noticed Artax beckoning her, she jumped from her spot and hurried over to him. She was short. Everything about her was short. And brown. Short brown hair, short brown skirt, short brown tunic, and brown leggings that were too short to reach her ankles. Regardless of her squatness and odd attire, she was cute and affable. She peered up at Artax, her bright brown eyes eager with anticipation and admiration. "Evening, Jetta. Could you please bring 3 plates of food to my hut?"
"Certainly, sir."
She curtsied and rushed off. "Come, we'll eat and discuss matters privately." Before entering the hut, Pantheus checked on Kessa, who was happily stuffing buttered bread into her mouth and conversing with the people around her between bites. Smirking, he stooped beneath the door frame and vanished into the hut. Artax was busy clearing the table and pouring drinks while Aquestria stoked the fire. Jetta arrived a short time later and placed the plates of food on the table. Smiling captivatingly, she asked if they needed anything else. Artax patted her arm, oblivious to her resulting quiver and the instant coloring of her cheeks. "Thank you, Jetta. This will do nicely." Artax might have been oblivious, but Aquestria was not. She watched Jetta with interest, as she stood there awkwardly for a moment before comprehending the polite dismissal. After Jetta had left and each of them had their first couple of bites, Artax wiped his lips and said, "I'm going against Red Talon policy here by sharing the information, but I feel I can trust you. I was informed via messenger of the date, method, and location of Kessa's execution, and assigned her rescue a couple days beforehand. This is the first time I've ever been asked to rescue anyone, never mind a complete stranger. The higher-ups must believe that she has something crucial to contribute to our cause, or she'd be 6 feet under by now. Simple as that." "You have no further orders?" With a shrug of his shoulders, Artax replied, "I'm to keep her safe." "So we wait then," Pantheus affirmed.
"Well, we've Malieous to worry about," Aquestria said after finishing the piece of venison she'd been chewing.
"Yes, what to do with Lord Fane?" Artax mused, his eyes alighting on Aquestria like she was a long-awaited answer to a most perplexing riddle. "You must have some suggestions, Lady Fane." She opened her mouth to reply when the hut flap lifted, interrupting her. "A message has arrived for you, Artax," Rake announced through the gap. Excusing himself, Artax left the hut. Pantheus and Aquestria looked at one another. "What do you think?" "I still have questions, Pantheus, but I don't think Artax will answer them. Perhaps time will." "Aquestria, you're aware of the myths that surround your husband. He's always been shrouded in mystery. No one really knows who he is or where he comes from, except you." Shaking her head, she stood up and approached the doorway. "If you're asking me to reveal any unknown details about Malieous, or to dispel any of those myths, I'm afraid I'll have to disappoint you." Shifting the flap slightly, she peeked out curiously, hoping to catch a glimpse of what was going on. A message arriving around supper time was bound to be important, or at the very least interesting. "You're seriously going to keep his secrets for him, even now?" Letting the flap fall back into place, Aquestria focused on her companion, who was sitting stock still and eyeing her with a wary indignation. "Pantheus." "Aquestria, he almost executed your sister. If he gets his hands on her, he will try again. And now he's after me, too. You heard Kessa. He'll kill us all on the king's command. Lord Aegeon's right, Artax warned, re-entering the hut. Rolling her eyes, Equestria sat back down. I've no secrets to keep, truth be told. My husband was, and is, an extremely mysterious individual. I don't even know his birth date. You're his wife. Naturally, you know something we don't. She laughed without mirth. Sure, as his wife I know things you don't. But you aren't after the things a wife knows. The sort of knowledge you're after, sadly, I know little more than you. By Malieous' request, we didn't discuss his past. He's Akara's dungeon keeper. Has been since the rule of King Ash, as far as I know. Elite soldiers are sent to him in order to undergo grueling physical and psychological training. He dabbles in espionage, interrogation, arbitration, and occasionally administration. Often he's called upon to hunt dangerous criminals who have otherwise eluded capture. He's very much a behind-the-scenes type of man. You forgot to mention assassin, Artax said. Executioner, actually, she corrected. Same thing in this case. It isn't. Is. Isn't. What was the message, Artax? Pantheus asked, steering the discussion in a more productive direction. The king is in Tinea. It's doubtful his presence there will go over peacefully. We have 3 days to pack up and move to a base that's closer to Tinea. You are to support Lord Tineius, I presume. That's our orders. I think we should all get some sleep. We're all clearly worn out. Although absolute agreement hadn't been a theme of the discussion, no one refuted that logic. I should examine Kessa's wounds. She's pretty beat up, Pantheus said, opening the tent flap. The full volume of boisterous music, singing, dancing, and the pandemonium that was the rebel base after dinner blasted him. Raising his voice so Artax and Equestria could hear him, he asked, Do you see her? A quick search located her curled up on a bench by the fire, fast asleep, surrounded by revelers and still clutching a half-eaten piece of venison. Suppressing an amused grin, Artax suggested, We can carry her to the medical hut. She and Equestria can sleep in there tonight. Sounds good, Equestria replied. Pantheus gently lifted Kessa into his arms, and Equestria removed the venison with some difficulty due to her tenacious grip, which sleep didn't seem to affect.